Welcome to the Design Defect. Steve, please don't shoot me, and what are we doing here today?
Well, Jamie, as long as the 32X launch games are the last Sega games we cover for this year, then I don't think I'm going to have to shoot you again.
Steve, you know I didn't even want to do this anyway. I just want to review the Sega Pico Beta.
The Sega Pico... the what? No, let's just stick to 32X games. You've got the first one. Let's just do it.
Fine. Okay, let's roll it. Corpse Killer is a full-motion video game developed and published by Digital Pictures, which you're probably pretty familiar with if you've already watched our Sega CD episode. Released for the Sega CD, 32X, Saturn, and even the 3DO, Corpse Killer was basically the kiss of death for the four major consoles released in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get past the title screen for the 32X version of the game, so I decided to give the Sega CD a shot instead. Well, I guess we can't talk too much about gameplay then, but we can at least do a quick comparison of the video quality between the two versions during the almost enjoyable intro segment. While they each are heavily boxed in, the Sega CD version is so compressed it's barely watchable next to the 32X counterpart. Granted, it's actually slightly better than the video quality in Night Trap on the Sega CD, but that's really not saying much. The game is supposed to play out like the classic arcade shooter Lethal Enforcers, so maybe it's kind of fun to play if you can manage to actually start the game. Interestingly, some footage from Corpse Killer and a few other Digital Pictures games were actually used in the film Game Over, released in 2003 starring Yasmin Bleeth and Walter Koenig.
Welcome to hell, sucker! Get your booty down here, you poor damn fool! Winston gonna cut you down, man. But we gotta jump quick now. Zombie come.
Alright, let's get this game out of the way really quick. We already covered Night Trap and gave you some history in our last episode, so let's look at a few of the differences here. Firstly, the video quality is vastly improved over the Sega CD version. They even filmed a few new scenes for this one. See this generic controller he's holding in the 32X version? In the Sega CD Night Trap, he was holding a standard 3-button Genesis controller.
So pay close attention to what they're saying.
Beyond the video, they made some obvious UI updates, but overall the game is pretty much the same on just about any platform you play it on. Lastly, Night Trap was the first game to receive a mature 17 rating from Sega's own video game rating council. Nice work, Night Trap!
So, I really like motocross games. Excitebike 64 was one of my favorite games for the N64. I love all the MX vs ATV games, and I openly admit to Dirt Tracks FX being one of my favorite games on the Super Nintendo in our first episode. Want me to go on? Because I can. See the Jaguar game? Played it, beat it, and I'd do it again if I still had it. Basically, from my perspective, it's really hard to make a motocross game I won't get any enjoyment from. Well, Arctic Studios not only accepted that challenge, but they managed to knock it out of the park. I've never played a less inspired or worse playing racing game than this, and hopefully I never will again. Let's start with, the start. Each race starts off like this. Sadly, this is the most fun I had in the game. Well, that and seeing what all the characters off the side of the track sound like when I run into them. Well, I'm glad we solved that mystery. Like other motocross games, you have to adjust your pitch to drive smoothly around the track, but unlike other motocross games, this happens. Okay, so I think you know where I stand with this game, so let's go back to the fun part.
Considered a spiritual successor to Fighting Masters by Almanac, Cosmic Carnage is an ambitious fighter that initially impressed people with flashy graphics and a unique customization mechanic. I also remember being jealous of the neat scaling effect during gameplay that my poor little SNES just couldn't replicate even if it tried. The big colorful characters are great, though the backgrounds can be a tad uninspired. The gameplay itself is a bit on the stiff side, but I've definitely played far worse fighters. Beyond just looking cool, the armor you select determines the special move you can use during gameplay. If you lose your armor, you can no longer execute your special ability, so it's more than just something pretty to look at. There are also death moves in the game, and overall it's just as violent as any other game following in Mortal Kombat's footsteps from the 90s. This is one of the more unique 32X titles that I think is worth looking at, even if it's just for the novelty alone.
Here's a controversial port of one of the best games of all time. Like pretty much every console edition of Doom from the 90s, Doom for the 32X is based on the Atari Jaguar version of the game. Unlike the Jaguar game, though, the 32X port is largely a missed opportunity. Let's start with the music. I think it's safe to say that this is the worst music on the 32X and easily the worst rendition of Doom's classic soundtrack. If you don't mind insulting your eardrums for a few seconds, just listen to this garbage. Okay, point proven. Now, while the frame rate is decent for its time, we're giving up a lot of our precious screen real estate to pull this off. The lighting in the 32X version is also flatter than the Jag version and certainly a far cry from the PS1 version of the game. I can live with the smaller screen and the crappy lighting, however. I can even live with the abrasive soundtrack, but one thing that really ruins this would-be masterpiece for the 32X is the sprites themselves. The sprites may look okay at a glance, but I assume due to memory constraints, they can always only face forward. The problem with this is that it ruins what is one of the coolest and most fun gameplay mechanics of the game, and that's getting the enemies to fight each other. It's impossible for a Pinky to turn around mid-chomp and take out an unsuspecting imp now, because they just don't have the animations to support this. As it stands, the 32X version of Doom just barely escapes being completely terrible. Well, Jamie, I gotta admit, that first batch of games gave me an itchy trigger finger. How about you?
I'm a little bit nervous. Are they going to be worse or better?
I don't know, man. We're just gonna have to check them out.
Oh, shoot.
Hello, I'm Fred Couples. Welcome to Golf Magazine's 36 Great Holes.
Golf Magazine presents 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples may not be the worst video game title ever, but it just may have the most syllables of any game released on the Sega console. As far as golf games go, this is, well, just look at it.
That'll play.
For a 32X game, they did a good job with the visuals. Just capturing a single frame of a detailed 3D environment and never following the ball was a smart way to make the game look better than the system was actually capable of. As for the roster, you can pick from a wide assortment of golfers including Fred Couples and, well, that's it. Okay, well at least you can fall back on this inspired character creation feature. Well, yeah. There are a few interesting modes here, and I love the idea of playing a random 18 holes instead of one of the included courses, but there's just not a lot else to say about this game. Next!
Now we get to a title that not only stands out on the console, but stands out because, hey, it's actually pretty good. Space Harrier on the 32X was nearly arcade perfect save for dropping a frame every once in a while. This is one of the few titles actually worth showing to your friends if for whatever reason you felt inclined to show off your expansive 32X collection. Unlike the Master System and Genesis versions of the game, the 32X uses actual sprite scaling and looks super smooth because of it. If you never played Space Harrier, this is a great place to start. If you don't have access to a 32X or don't want to figure out how to get a 32X simulator running on your computer, there are plenty of other versions out there. The best of which is hands down the 3DS port that supports stereoscopic 3D and widescreen. The port of this classic game to the 3DS apparently took 18 months to finish, and while that sounds like a long time, the results are stellar, so check it out if you can. When the 32X was first announced, there was one game that put a lot of people on the fence about buying one. While there wasn't a lot of content, the visuals of Sega's own Star Wars Arcade put Star Fox to shame, running at a much smoother frame rate. I never played the arcade version of this 32X port, but I loved the classic that was released back in 1983, featuring colorful vector graphics and even a snazzy cockpit if you went to the right venue. Today there's not much to get hyped about with this one. The Force is certainly not present in the gameplay as you pilot an X-Wing through a whopping 3 stages across themes from the first trilogy. I want to like this game because I think the audio and visuals are great, but it just feels like I'm trying to steer a brick through endless predictable waves of enemies that often take me out of the experience when one of the TIE fighters just passes right through me. This happens a lot, by the way. With so many incredible Star Wars games around the time this was released, it's really hard to recommend this one, as it's very easy to find another title that does everything Star Wars Arcade is trying to do better.
Virtua Racing!
Most people remember Virtua Racing as Sega's groundbreaking 3D racing game that was introduced to arcades in the early 90s. What some people probably aren't aware of though is that this game was set to be a flagship title for Sega's own VR headset. As such, Virtua Racing is one of the last remnants of Sega's mass-market affordable VR that was canned just before release in the early 90s. Sure, the game blew everyone away in arcades, but imagine if instead of playing it on a flat screen, you are actually wearing a VR headset and freely looking around your virtual world. If that tech is only now just blowing people's minds, imagine what that would have done to people 20 years ago. As the first game to come out on the Sega's Module 1 arcade board, Virtua Racing still had a major impact on the video game industry, and there were many other games sporting the Virtua moniker that turned into popular franchises for years to come. While I'm sad we never got to see Virtua Racing in its original intended format, I'm hopeful now that since VR is an actual consumer product, Sega will give us the vision they once had on a headset near you.
Afterburner Complete is a near-perfect arcade port of Afterburner 2, save for one important feature. Afterburner 2 in the arcade actually ran at 60 FPS, while the 32X port only runs at 30. The game is still highly playable, but it definitely lacks the speed and intensity of its arcade counterpart. The speed and smoothness of Afterburner is really the series' identity after all, and if you take that away, you'd have a pretty bland arcade shooter, so it was pretty risky in this specific instance cutting back on the frame rate. But that's not to say that the 32X version feels slow or anything. In fact, if you've never played any other version of the game, you might think the developers were insane for making a flight combat game this fast and out of control. All that is to say that in spite of slashing the frame rate in half, Afterburner Complete is still a rock-solid port of an already excellent arcade game, and while it probably wasn't the best choice for a system seller, I think if they packed this in with Space Harrier and Star Wars Arcade as a giant arcade collection, like they did with Sega Arcade Classics compilation disc on the Sega CD, this would have been much better received at the time. Overall, Afterburner is a great series, and this port isn't a bad place to jump in if you've never played any of them before.
Steve, I don't like the way things are shaping out. What are you going to do?
Well, Jamie, man, honestly, I was thinking you just shoot me this time.
Hopefully the sweet release we need is the end of this series.
Wait, so no more Sega launch titles? We're done?
We are finished. We are done.
Oh, this is the best Thanksgiving ever.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Join us next time when we cover Sega Genesis 3D games.
What? No!